Hello everyone and welcome to another video. As you can see, I'm in a completely different location as to where I normally am, and the sound and visuals are a little bit better. Recently I had the chance to speak to Alan Wareing, ex-Doctor Who director who'd worked on 3 Sylvester McCoy stories, and lucky enough to speak to him. So this is a bit of a one-off, so please enjoy my interview with Alan. So, Alan, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to me. Did you think, after all these years, that people would be still interested in the work you did on Doctor Who?
Yes, well, it's never really let up. Since I directed them, the 3 stories, uh, I've always been asked questions. I've been asked for interviews on the telephone and at conventions, because this show is quite unlike almost anything else that British television offers. And the audiences, the fans, are more loyal than anything else I can imagine. Terrific, really, and millions of them.
Do you think that the fan base has changed over the years and that it's still loved by so many people?
Yes, it's all ages, still all ages. In fact, when you go to the conventions, sometimes they come as a family, mum, dad and the children. And of course some come dressed up as their favourite characters, and it's quite interesting. I've never known anything like it, and I've directed a lot of British television drama of various types, but nothing quite like Doctor Who.
And with such a loyal fan base, does it feel like an old friend that keeps cropping up?
Yes, it sort of keeps coming back. Sometimes I think that Doctor Who then wouldn't hold up by today's standards of television, but of course things were very different then. And yet, when I watched them, I think some of it is quite good.
Well, it does have that appeal, that warmth and that slight quirky charm that's now attached to it.
But part of the charm, I think, of Doctor Who as it was, and I'm not talking about the present day Doctor Who, was that it was done on a low budget, and that there was a slight amateur element to it occasionally, which was, I think, is part of the charm. There was some, don't get me wrong, great performances, great characters, and some really dramatic moments. But by today's standards, I think someone might look at it. The bosses at the BBC at the time looked at it upon as something that was a bit amateur and they needed to get rid of.
Another key element of the show is the Daleks.
Yeah.
And even in their recent adaptation, they're still going strong.
I never worked with the Daleks. I'm very disappointed. None of my stories were in fact, they were not really, I didn't have monsters in the same way. I didn't really have any monsters in mine. In the first one I had some clowns. They were sinister. They weren't monsters. I didn't have rubber monsters and things. And the last story, which was Ghostlight, was in a haunted house. Well, not a haunted house, but a house that had haunted memories. So that was also Victoriana. And that wasn't monsters either. There were no Daleks or Cybermen, which is a bit disappointing because I quite like to have done that, but that's the way it worked out.
Even though you only directed 3 stories, do you have a particular favourite Doctor?
Well, my first Doctor, when I worked on the show, was Tom Baker, who was incredible to work with, very creative, and came up with brilliant ideas as well. And I guess, in a way, that a lot of people will say Tom Baker was their favourite. But I worked with Sylvester when I directed the show, and Sylvester was, well, he was an entertainer, he was a performer, and a good actor, but not in the strict sense of the word, because he liked to sort of create as he went along. He liked to change things, and and sometimes it was quite entertaining. Sometimes it was a pain, but he was wonderful to work with. And Sophie Aldred, his assistant, was great as well. In fact, I saw them last year, and they were both doing well.
Before you directed your 3 stories, you had previously worked on the show as a first assistant director. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yes, the first time I worked on Doctor Who was when Tom Baker was the Doctor, and I was the AD, assistant director, which is a slightly different job. But he was tremendous to work with, and we had lots of fun at the outside rehearsal rooms when we were actually creating the stories, so to speak. And of course, the studio time was always tight, as anyone will tell you. That so we had to just crack on with it, and sometimes it was hard to get it in. But it was wonderful working with Tom. And then I worked on it again when Colin Baker, no relative, I don't think, relation, was the Doctor, and I was an AD on it then. And Colin was a completely different character. But that's the wonder of Doctor Who, because with the reincarnations of the Doctor, they can become different characters. And the magic of the show is that the only two constants are the current Doctor and his companion, and everything else is pure fantasy. So you start effectively with a blank canvas, and it's all created in the rehearsal rooms before you shoot it, which was fantastic. And I don't know if that occurs today on the current Doctor Who, but that's the way it was then. And it was wonderful because we did some wonderful things. For instance, in the Greatest Show in the Galaxy, Sylvester had to entertain the gods of Ragnarok. I think they were called Ragnarok. It was a long time ago. And he did it with conjuring tricks. So we got a magician to come into rehearsals to teach him how to do the conjuring tricks. And that was wonderful. And he was full of enthusiasm and eager to learn, and very quick learner as well. And it looked quite good, I think, his conjuring tricks. So that was one of those things. It was pure fantasy, and anything that we did, the characters were created in the rehearsal rooms. I'm not saying that the writer hadn't created them in his writing, but they came to life in the rehearsal rooms. It was lovely.
You mentioned rehearsal rooms.
Yes.
I would have imagined you rehearsed in the studio, but where were these rehearsal rooms?
Well, in those days, the rehearsal rooms are at North Acton in London and West London. And there was a big sort of tower block of rehearsal rooms. And so when you turned up at the rehearsal rooms, they could be rehearsing anything from Top of the Pops dancers to a variety show to a comedy. And we would spend probably about 10 days in rehearsals, and we would mark the show through, from reading it through to start with, blocking the actors in their positions, and then towards the end, the technical bods would turn up, so you could show it to them, so they knew how they were going to light it and where they were going to put the sound booms and so on. And then the producer would watch it to make sure that we captured everything that the producer wanted. Then we'd go into the studio and we'd shoot it quickly, because we were always short of time. But we had to know what we were doing before we went into the studio. For instance, Ghostlight, which was the last of the Doctor Who stories, were all shot in the studio. Nothing was shot on location. And it was one big studio set, which was magnificent. But the pressures to get it shot were enormous. So we had to know what we were doing before we went in there.
During the work in the rehearsal rooms, would you change the script now and again?
Yes, it's a good question. That sometimes when we worked on in the rehearsal rooms, you would find that the script didn't quite fit, and so we would contact the writer and say, can we change this so that it flows more, and usually they were quite happy about that. But they were all very closely involved. The writers were the writers were closely involved in the whole process, rehearsals through to recording.
And what writers did you work with?
Mark Platt did Ghostlight, and in fact it was a 3-part story, but he'd written enough material for a 4-part story, and we had to be very careful when we cut it, and we had to sort of say, we can't shoot that we haven't got time, and we can't get it all in. Stephen Wyatt wrote, Stephen Wyatt, yes, wrote The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, and a Scottish writer called Rona Monroe wrote Survival, which was in my second year doing it. The first year I just did The Greatest Show in the Galaxy, which is a 4-part story. In the second year, I did 2 3-part stories, Survival, which was mostly location work, shot in Dorset, and a Ghostlight, which was all studio.
In those days, it wasn't so easy to edit as it is now. Was there much pressure knowing you couldn't keep stopping and starting? Did it feel like it was live?
The way television was recorded in those days was that you would rehearse it outside and go into the studio and shoot it, because there wasn't a huge amount of editing time. So we tended to shoot scenes in their entirety rather than waiting to get into the edit suite to put them together. Particularly the studio work, which was what would be called continuous recording. But as I said earlier, we knew what we were doing because we spent days in rehearsal going through it with a fine-tooth comb, so that when we got into the studio, we knew exactly what was going to happen. It doesn't work like that these days, but that's another story.
So the 3 stories you directed all starred Sylvester McCoy and Sophie Aldred as the Doctor and Ace. I hear they made quite a team. What were they like to direct?
Well, they did work very well together. They were a team. Of course, that's the way it works in any television. Hopefully, if the actors get on well together and have empathy, then it makes for a more conducive atmosphere. But Sophie and Sylvester did get on very well together, and they were both very, very into their characters. Now, the point is that, as you know, the Doctor was a character that was started off in 1963, but all his companions weren't necessarily a reincarnation of early ones. So Sophie had created Ace as a one-off character, really, and she was. I mean, she was something else. Of course, Ghostlight was all about her going back to where she was brought up in Perivale and visiting the house that she feared when she was a child. And that made it quite a big story for her, quite a lot of work, but we had a wonderful time doing it, even though it was pressured in the studio.
You were thrown in at the deep end with the first story you directed, The Greatest Show in the Galaxy. Wasn't there an issue with the studio?
Yes. They found asbestos in the BBC studios, and they had to close the studios. They had to strip the asbestos out. And so at one point, they were going to cancel the shooting of the show. We'd already shot on location, quite a lot of work, and we shot in a China Clays quarry in Dorset, and they'd come back to be told that they were just going to throw it away, and that the studios we couldn't do it in the studios. But John Nathan Turner, who was the producer at the time, decided that he would fight this, and he decided that made some inquiries, and because luckily the show was inside a big top in the Psychic Circus, which is the greatest show in the galaxy, as you know, we actually put a tent up in the car park at BBC Elstree, right by the main gate, and we were allowed a little bit more shooting time, because instead of having multi-cameras, which we would have had in the studio, we were shooting it more like a location shoot. So they gave us a bit more time, but it was still hard. But we were fortunate, because there were certain things that we could do on location that we wouldn't have been allowed to do in the studio, particularly the trapeze work, swinging, where the Doctor has to swing on a rope from one side of the big top to the other. And when we were going to do it in the studio, they were saying you won't be allowed to do that. But we managed to do it because we were on a location. Don't ask me what the rules were that were different, but anyway, that's what we did. And it was marvellous, except that, of course, we kept having to stop because they kept on letting cars in through the main gate, driving straight past the past the tent, and a lot of people walking to and from work, chatting as they walk by. So we were constantly asking, can you please be quiet while we shoot this? Of course, they didn't know what was going on outside. But it was quite an achievement to get it done. And the designer made a marvellous job, because actually some of the sets that were due to be built in the studio, he built inside the big top, which was... and so we got away with it, I think, it was a marvellous show, and I was very proud of it. And I think that, again, as I mentioned to you in the earlier question, Sylvester had learnt these conjuring tricks, and we had to have the whole of the ancient circus, where we saw the stone gods. That was the same space inside the circus tent that only a couple of days earlier had been the real circus. So we had to overnight get in there and pull that out and put the ancient circus in, which of course then collapsed on the final day of our shoot, when we had to collapse the ancient circus. Of course, we had to do it on the last day because there's no going back then. Once we'd done that, the set had gone. It's marvellous, a lot of fun to do, and I'm really pleased that we actually fought the system and got it done.
Ghostlight was the last story you shot. It also ended up being the last story of the classic series. Did you ever think you would be the last director of the original run?
Ghostlight was the last story I did, and it was a tremendous story to do. It was all done in the studio, as I mentioned earlier, and in a fantastic Victorian house set, with a superb cast of actors, including, of course, Sylvester and Sophie. We had a really good time doing that show, and we all knew that it was going to be one of the good Doctor Who's, so different from a lot of them because there were no monsters as such. It was just characters, development of characters. I sort of did know that this was going to be, that the BBC weren't recommissioning the series, but I can't remember all the details about it. But I was aware that the BBC had thought that it was possibly come to the end of its natural life, although, of course, as you would probably agree, we were disagreeing with that, because the very essence of Doctor Who is that you can go anywhere with these characters and put them in any situation. So the possibilities are endless, were endless, and still are. So whatever the reasons that the BBC decided to pull the series, of course, wasn't unanimous amongst the people that made the programme.
Have you had the chance to watch any of the new series? And if so, what is your opinion?
Well, I've only seen clips of the new series, and I've seen various Doctors, David Tennant, and the latest one, Peter Capaldi. I think it's a marvellous show. I think it's really nice. Of course, it's completely different to the way it was when I did it. Obviously, they're spending more money on it now, which is probably a good thing. The sets look good. The post-production's very complete, and I think it's a good product. But I don't really watch it. It's just that it's not on at the right time of day for me.
Alan, thank you very much for giving me your time.
Okay, Luke, thank you very much.
So thank you for watching. As usual, the links are in the description below, and I've also left links to where you can buy the 3 stories that Alan directed if you're interested on the BBC shop. So thank you. It's a bit of a different one, and I hope you enjoyed for any Doctor Who fans watching, and I'll see you whenever I make another video. So goodbye.